Over the coming week, and indeed for the next couple of years, the nations of the world will be pondering the idea of a global pandemic treaty. Some of the responses to this have been somewhat excited and colourful, so let's take a look to see what's really going on. Now, I made a few notes before I did any of the research for this video, just asking myself what would be a good, legitimate global response to the pandemic. Because I think most people, even those that strongly disagree on the details, would agree that how the world responded to COVID wasn't ideal. I don't know of anyone on any side who's saying what a raging triumph the last couple of years have been. So it's a valid question to wonder, is there a degree of cooperation we could agree internationally that would make it better if it were, God forbid, to happen again? After all, we saw supply chain chaos, countries were slapping export bans on medicines and PPE that they produced, certain countries snatched supplies that were on their way to somebody else, modern piracy, one politician called it. The reason for all of that, of course, is that in a crisis, countries prioritised first and foremost the well-being of their own people. Well, mostly. There were certain powerful players seeking to gain geopolitical advantage through vaccine diplomacy, for example, ahead of prioritising their own citizens, but mostly it was a scramble to look after your own. Now that dynamic is wholly natural. It is not going to change, particularly for democracies where politicians are tasked with serving the people that elected them and could elect them out. But that only leads to discarding the rules if the rules have become an impediment rather than a support. So could you envisage that a better infrastructure of, say, high quality PPE, for instance, would be able to be mobilised rapidly on the basis of need that might be a setup that the countries of the world would see the value of investing in? Could you produce something that wouldn't fall apart in the heat of a crisis? It seems legitimate to ask the question, if that's actually the question that's being asked. Plus, you would be pleased if there could be an agreement on information sharing and openness, which seems like a fond wish. I can't see why any such agreement would ever have led, for instance, China to behave differently to the way that it did over the last couple of years. And that's the point. At the heart of any such treaty, you will inevitably have the tension between the nation-statist approach that everyone ultimately devolves to and a globalist approach as championed by the World Health Organization sitting where it does and the various globalist figures that support it. And my final reflection prior to doing the research was that in spite of some of the alarmist narratives I'd seen from several quarters, I wouldn't expect such a treaty would involve any form of giving up national sovereignty because countries will defend their ability to act in a crisis. Nor would I expect any treaty to mandate what measures must be taken for future pandemics because that wouldn't make much sense, given that the details of any new pathogen can differ significantly and would require different responses depending on the details and depending on the local circumstances. Now, of course, there are those that have persuaded themselves that all sorts of alternative universe explanations of what happened over the last couple of years. And if you've become deeply cynical about every single thing in the way that some people have, then any initiative of this sort will only be taken as the next opportunity to see shadows lurking dangerously in the background. But if we're looking to see the world clearly, to examine what the evidence might be and where it points, then as a starting point, we should agree that it must be possible to have an international agreement that things could be better than last time. Better how? Well, that's rather where I expected all the stumbles and obstacles would come. One of the reasons why one might be legitimately cautious on all of this is that I'm still not convinced yet we've fully reached the full depth of historical insight on what should have been done last time. We had so much culture war propagandizing on different sides, people stake so much of their identity on which policy should be promoted, which is not historically how we normally approach pandemics. We've not recovered anything like a sense of rational equilibrium. So when people go raising the alarm that a pandemic treaty would mean enforced lockdowns and all of that, I don't see how that could be true, but you can understand the state of mind that fears that some at least would be wishing that it would be. and exploring whether it might. So one of the main arguments for the proposition that there should be a pandemic treaty or agreement of some sort was expressed in a letter in the Lancet, which came from an event held in London at the beginning of April, which was titled Paying the Pandemic Piper: Global Health and Economic Security. There are a number of core recommendations that had come out of that conference and they wanted to promote. For international institutions to focus on fulfilling their unique capabilities by sharing knowledge between countries, pooling resources and distributing benefits equitably between countries, monitoring the preparedness of health systems within and across countries, and convening national actors effectively and in real time. As framed, it would be easy to either agree with or to fight with that, because it all rather depends on what the fine words actually mean in practice. Here was the clarification on the first part about knowledge sharing. First, international institutions should synthesize, create and share knowledge of which health policies work and which do not, rather than trying to duplicate or mandate national actions. For example, different national lockdown policies have had wildly divergent benefits and costs, yet there is no repository of global comparative data to analyse the impacts of lockdowns to date. So on that version from some academics, it's about not mandating national actions but gathering better intelligence from across the world about what works and what doesn't. I would find that hard to disagree with because yes, different policies had widely divergent benefits and costs. Having some rational assessment of all that would definitely be beneficial. The value, though, would come in the skill of execution of the study, of course. And the trouble is that in the heat of the fire, we saw health institutions with a mixed record on the quality of advice and an unfortunate habit of slipping into propaganda mode. Once you've seen health authorities saying that anti-lockdown protests would be a massive COVID spreader, but Black Lives Matter protests are just fine, then you're going to be concerned whether the institutions you're talking about are capable of the integrity that you would need to be able to do it. Now, it doesn't mean that you should assume that they never could have that integrity, but you sure as heck want to check. And the problem with global institutions is that they are very susceptible to the geopolitics. The WHO won't mention the word Taiwan, for instance, even though they provided an early effective case study of action into COVID-19. So, okay, some interesting principles, but we have some scepticism. Well, what's happening now? At a special session of the World Health Assembly last year, member states agreed to establish an intergovernmental negotiating body, INB, to draft a convention agreement or other international instrument on pandemic preparedness under the Constitution of the World Health Organization, the so-called Pandemic Treaty, although it's not clear at the moment whether it will be a treaty, was proposed by Chile and the European Union. And this sort of thinking led to a joint article by a group of world leaders, including UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson. The statement of intent included this passage: "The main goal of this treaty would be to foster an all-of-government and all-of-society approach, strengthening national, regional and global capacities and resilience to future pandemics. This includes greatly enhancing international cooperation to improve, for example, alert systems, data sharing, research and local, regional and global production and distribution of medical and public health countermeasures, such as vaccines, medicines, diagnostics and personal protective equipment." So, as written there, you'd say more in line with what I previously expected before I'd done the research, not so much some of the nightmare visions. Lots more good things, nobody giving anything up. Of course, the road to hell can be paved with good intentions, so we don't get fobbed off quite as easily as that. The letter also said that this would happen as a coordinated approach under the existing international health regulations, which would, quote, underpin such a treaty. Those are regulations that did not do tremendously well during the time of COVID-19. But we move on. The timetable is that there will be a second round of public consultation hearings on the 16th to 17th of June this year. A working draft treaty will be considered by the beginning of August. A progress report will go to the World Health Assembly in 2023, and a final submission of the outcome for consideration will go to the following assembly in 2024. Worth noting that on that timetable, it's somewhat premature to jump to any conclusions about what will be in the final proposed treaty. And I say this because there's already been a well-supported petition to Parliament saying that before signing up to any pandemic treaty, the UK should hold a referendum. That's a proposition based on the alarmist messaging some have been distributing, saying that the plan is for the treaty to subsume national sovereignty to the WHO or to someone else. Now, the idea of holding a referendum would only make sense in that specific scenario, but it's not a very likely scenario. I mean, it's hard to understand why the government that spent the last 2 years pushing Brexit through is suddenly desperately keen to hand over sovereignty to the WHO. And of course, they're not. Likewise, some had claimed that amendments from the Biden administration in the US to the international health regulations, which are being discussed this week, aim to do the same. I've poured through the legalese of it, and there's a link in the video description if you want to read it for yourself. Again, it doesn't. And I can't conceive of why it would be in the Biden administration's interests that it would. I mean, it doesn't mean that the proposals are necessarily good ones, and it doesn't mean there aren't some genuine globalist elements that would like to achieve just that. But that's different to the cartoon version.
New opportunities to shape the future of global health security. We're just shaping the future. That's controlling the future. What shape is it? It's not the shape of a boot on your face forever.
Thanks, Russell. People who think there's an agenda that somehow the World Health Organization would be running the world don't entirely get how threadbare, small and underfunded the WHO actually is. Its entire budget would just about pay for 4 minutes on the edge of space courtesy of Jeff Bezos. It has no effective executive role. You might as well give global power to, I don't know, a chapter of the Boy Scouts.
Hooray!
The truth is that some of the globalists would love for the treaty to be the thing that people fear it to be. But it's simply not going to happen because it's completely contrary to how this works. So first of all, a pandemic treaty is not going to be negotiated by a bunch of technocrats. It's not going to be negotiated by Bill Gates. It's going to be negotiated by nation states on the same principles of all international negotiations, which is what will benefit the negotiating parties. The majority of countries outside the West are not interested in some globalist kumbaya moment. They feel aggrieved that the Western countries kept provisions for themselves in the earliest stages of the pandemic, only releasing support as their own top priority needs were met. They look at the globalist ideal, and what they really want is a legally enforceable mechanism to require a more equitable distribution in time of emergency. And this is a microcosm of the whole dynamic of global institutions. You have the great powers, America and China now. The global institutions don't really have anything that they need, and consequently they tend to look at those institutions with a degree of contempt. Because the only role that such institutions can play is to constrain the great powers in the interests of smaller countries, and the great powers have no interest in being so constrained. For the smaller and particularly poorer countries, they are huge fans of a rule-based global system that gives countries equal weight, because it's the only support mechanism they have to defend their interests against the wishes of the big powers. And that is at the heart of the fight. So the pandemic treaty won't really, regardless of the rhetoric, be about better actioning the best scientific intelligence about combating pandemics. It'll be about how the wealthy countries who generate the solutions, the vaccines, be prevented from rejecting the all-in-this-together sentiments in all but name when the crisis comes. And the answer is they can't and they won't. And we've seen it starkly in the pandemic. The COVAX initiative was set up on sound globalist ideals to distribute vaccines to where they were needed. And while paying lip service to the ideal, while pushing what they could spare to give it the visibility of action, every Western government unashamedly followed vaccine nationalism, and not a one of them has since declared they were wrong to do so. Even the European Union, which as a globalist-minded institution seeks to get its member states to buy into that mindset vis-à-vis the institution of the EU itself, On the one hand, it demonstrated in glowing technicolor the downsides of a globalist approach. The EU succeeded in getting the acquiescence of its member states to its coordinating approach, and then it did a terrible job. Bureaucratic, slow, ineffective, leading some of those countries to break ranks and sort out their own arrangements. And in response to its shortcomings, the EU quickly became one of the most aggressively vaccine nationalist forces in the world, showing it was quite prepared to discard the rule of law in a crisis. This sort of dilemma isn't new when it comes to international disease management issues. The WHO has generally used what you would describe as soft law obligations, guidelines, frameworks. And that has been the case with measures such as the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework. To date, the WHO has only used genuine treaty-making powers once, which was the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Anyway, the EU, as one of the original driving forces, has tried to cover for its rather poor recent track record with globalist virtue signalling in its stated intentions for the treaty. Early detection and prevention, resilience to and response to pandemics, including universal access to medicines, vaccines and diagnostics. It's your choice whether you listen to what they are saying now or what they actually did in practice. The Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response recommended that the treaty should consider mechanisms for financing pandemic readiness with research and development, technology transfer, capacity building. Now, I think that's an area you could more realistically make things work. Spend the time before there's a crisis building the capacity in poorer countries to be able to respond better in their own interest when a crisis occurs. Make them stronger. That seems more realistic, desirable, and it goes with the grain of geopolitics. The challenge, of course, is that in areas where corruption is high, because your ability to build such institutions will always be weakened by corruption. As a rather left field example, if Russia's system had been less corrupt, its military would have been in better shape than we've seen it to be in the last few days. In that case, we can be thankful for the various people who siphoned off intended investment in up-to-date military equipment. But in any case, those recommendations came from an advisory body, an academic advisory body. The treaty won't be determined by them, as I said, it'll be determined by states negotiating in their self-interest. So many different groups of countries have such a grab bag wish list of items that it's more or less guaranteed that any attempt to build something that put them all together would fail. And when you look at the wish list, you would not say that they were founded on any sense that the analysis of what had gone wrong with COVID-19 was particularly complete or coherent. One thing that the critics have gotten essentially right, even if their expression of it often drifts into parody, is that the current concept of a treaty is essentially a globalist one, seeking to improve health for all, equity, one global human family, etc. For it to be viable in those terms, rich countries would have to be able to say what they'd be prepared to give up so that others can have more. Realistically, and reflected in their actions, although not their rhetoric, the answer is not much. The true globalists want the treaty to be legally binding, which would be able to hold powerful states accountable, but we've already seen that that won't fly. The original wording was for a legally binding instrument with a view to adoption under Article 19 of the WHO Constitution. Article 19 being the one that can facilitate such a treaty. At the World Health Assembly, that was changed to WHO Convention, Agreement or other international instrument with a view to adoption under Article 19 or under other provisions of the WHO Constitution as may be deemed appropriate. So space is already made for saying that it might not be a treaty at all and therefore would lack legal binding force. It's currently being considered under a framework convention approach, which would allow for consensus on high-level principles with then the specific details kicked down the road to be agreed later. And that could end up with a fragmented approach, which allows states to pick and choose which specific protocols within the treaty they wish to be party to. We've seen this elsewhere, for instance with the Convention on Biological Diversity, which had an added Nagoya Protocol. You had some states signing up to the convention alone, you had some others signing up to the convention and the protocol, and then you had the United States refusing to sign up to either. Obviously, that sort of fragmentation would be seen as disastrous for any globalists wanting a treaty as a mechanism to impose one approach to pandemic response. One of the problems they have is that what they want no longer fits the world we have, if it ever did. Within international law, legal agreement should first be interpreted in line with the principle of mutual supportiveness, which presumes against conflicts between legal regimes. Well, that's not a description of the world right now, you might have noticed. China refused to cooperate with information sharing precisely because it doesn't see the world as mutually supportive to it, and it behaves likewise. Russia hardly even needs to be mentioned in this context. Ultimately, this is not an environment where such a treaty is going to be taken seriously so long as it's about legally enforceable requirements. And it's not an environment that can enforce such provisions anyway. If it comes to seeking to ensure compliance with a treaty, you'd only have two options: incentives and sanctions. It's hard to know what incentives will be sufficient to cut through in a time of crisis for the wealthy nations. The answer is not very much. As for sanctions, well, first of all, the countries concerned wouldn't sign up to such a measure in the first place. Secondly, all you'd do would be to encourage greater secrecy around outbreaks so as to avoid being sanctioned. Some have argued that the WHO should be strengthened so that it can take a more powerful role in global governance in this sort of situation.
The shape of a boot on your face forever?
Yes, all right, but that's really a sign of how feeble it's been perceived to be over the last couple of years. The point is that the WHO's weakness is a feature, not a bug, in a statist world. If wealthy countries lobby for the WHO to be the home of a treaty, it's precisely because they want a weak institution with no meaningful democratic legitimacy to be the focus. Precisely because it can be overridden in an emergency. Pushing for something that sounds good, but they know would be ultimately unworkable should a crisis come along, something that they might confidently hope and expect would not happen, at least during their term of office. The cynicism of that shouldn't shock anyone. It's entirely what we've seen in the past. So no, the WHO isn't about to seize power. It's going to be more of a sort of power politics that looks exactly like what's happened in the past. It will get talked about, and it should, because it goes to the heart of a dilemma we genuinely have between global and national, technocracy versus national identity. Understanding that isn't helped by the people encouraging you to see it in the most distorted parody terms. We can aspire to do better than that. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.